Senior Partner of McKinsey and Company, Vishal, as well as our esteemed panel, Mr. Pramod Thomas, Senior Advisor from Clifford Capital, Mr. Mikael Larsen, Mr. Mikael Larsen, Mikael, Mr. Mikael Larsen, can I invite you to the panel, please? Mr. Mikael, CEO of Climate Impact X, Mr. Vikram Wich, Senior Advisor of the Climate Policy Initiative. Can I invite you up on stage? And last but not least, Mr. Eric Francia, President and CEO of the ACEN Corporation. So, Mr. Vishal, I hand over the stage to you.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for staying here during the lunch time. What we would like to talk about is the managed phase-out for coal-fired power plants. We have had a lot of discussion on the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. We have heard about, as in the previous panel, Yuki mentioned, a lot of acronyms from JETP to ETM to many other things. We have heard many attempts of early retirement of coal-fired power plants in the last 2 years. And if I just set the context, it boils down to who's going to pay for this, right? And the fact is there is a big economic gap to each coal-fired power plant that need to be retired early, especially so in Asia, where the average age of the fleet is about 14 years, right? And our estimate says that the gap is about $70 to $80 million per gigawatt. We're talking about 1,500 gigawatts in Asia alone. That adds up to about $100+ billion in the funding. And the concessionary, there's only so much concession capital that is floating around and can be used for many other different purposes. So the whole idea of what we have heard so far about launching traction, about the launch of the transition credit, in our understanding, is to bridge that gap, right? Now, let me kick off by asking you, Pramod, if you can just lay out how does this work and how will transition credit actually bridge the gap and move this whole debate from a concessionary capital to a more market-based mechanism?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Vishal. And good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to step back and maybe dimension the problem, which is correspondingly an opportunity. If we go back to your number, 1,500 gigs of coal-powered capacity, and look at the financing gap as well as the economic gap, the numbers are huge. And these are studies that were recently done in the MAS McKinsey paper that suggests that the financing gap is about $465 billion, and the economic gap, and that's jargon for the difference between a set of BAU cash flows and the cash flows as a result of the reduction of the life of the coal plant. So it's kind of an arcane concept, but it really points to the gap that needs to be bridged for a financing solution to work. Now, if we step away from those numbers, big as they are, the characteristics of early retirement of coal plants rely very heavily on blended finance type solutions, be it JETP or the ETM that's been worked on by ADB in a number of jurisdictions, rely on this notion of first loss concessional capital at the bottom of the capital stack. Now that would come from philanthropies, potentially from ADBs, from governments, but it is by definition a scarce commodity. And it's applied laser-like, like an acupuncture puncture, like someone described it yesterday, with completely serious intent and focus. And it's not likely to be freely available. So the central question, and my primary insight for this panel would be, it needs to be replaced by a market-based source of funding. And this work that's been going on transition credits might be one way to replace that concessional capital at the bottom of the capital stack. They are simply credits that are generated by an orderly early retirement and an equivalent creation of green energy. And to the extent we can demonstrate credibility with established standards and solve some typical problems around timing mismatch, we believe, and the work of the traction is going to be around creating this bridge to commerciality in early phase outs.
Yeah. So maybe I come to you, Vikram. We're talking about transition credit, right? And in the recent months and year, there has been a lot of debate around the credibility of these kind of credits, especially related to the nature-based, so on the nature-based solution side. How would investors or other stakeholders that are using these credits for early retirement of coal-fired power plant, how would they get the assurance, the transparency is there, the integrity is there? Maybe just explain to us how is this similar and or different to the credits that the market is used to on the nature-based solution side?
Oh boy, yes. Yes, short answer, very different from nature-based solutions. Let me just start, oversimplify, then get into a little bit more detail. One of the things that I think has been an issue is the whole issue around baselines, right? I mean, nature-based solutions have reference emission levels. They have the other kind of credits have these notional baselines that by definition will never be realized because renewables, for example, in the old days under the carbon market 1.0 used to go that way. The big difference, of course, within the subcategory of avoided credits is that transition credits don't rely necessarily on a notional or made-up baseline, right? I mean, as I'm sure we'll hear later from Eric, his plant's emitting CO2 now. If it shuts down, it's measurable in many ways. I'm simplifying, right? But that doesn't mean that every coal plant also would be eligible. There are hundreds of these. And to the point that was just made on being able to finance it, you want to make sure that there is an extremely high bar of integrity associated even with these issues. So just because they have a baseline doesn't mean it's just that. It has to be conservative. You need to look at what their long-term PPAs are, what their financial sort of time frame is, what the technical time frame is, what the regulatory time frame is, right? You have to worry about leakage. You have to worry about issues around what will replace these credits or these the coal-fired power plants, what will replace them. And the expectation is, of course, that renewables will replace them. So you have to worry about how much. So you have to put a threshold of a minimum level of renewables. We argue that it doesn't need to be 100. There has to be a Goldilocks zone, as the consortium is fond of saying, particularly Joe Curtin, who couldn't be here and whose voice I'm sort of channeling, but he's somewhere there at the back. So the point is that you need to be able to ensure that there is a minimum threshold of replacement. The methodology that we have developed, led by Rockefeller and the organization I work with now, the Climate Policy Initiative, the RMI, earlier known as Rocky Mountain, and then South Pole, have worked together to now establish this methodology covering all of these issues, right? And of course, along with it goes no new coal power commitments, and all the other eligibility criteria that we hear. Where it's what becomes extremely important, of course, is that we shouldn't, as we were discussing in a panel yesterday, we don't need to vilify coal power plant owners, but we have to vet them. But we also have to ensure that there is a conservative approach to giving them credits. And this then ripples into what was being said about financing these, because the financial sector, as we heard in the panel before, also needs a much higher level of integrity than you would see. So it's critical that we don't take this lightly, because one bad apple, one badly done deal could upset us before we sort of mobilize enough money to do the transition. The final point I'd like to make is that we have to worry about the workers in communities that get affected with the coal-fired plants. So any plant, at whatever level of methodology we do, has to address what generally gets called as just transition, right? And we think that methodologies of the kind that the Coal to Clean Credit Initiative, which you'll hear more about what we're going to do with MASS and ACEN at the end of this panel, helps advance it exactly along these parameters that I just laid out. So we can come back to a little more detail, but I'll stop now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it's a good segue to Eric here, right? We heard about thinking about baseline, thinking about this quote-unquote the Goldilocks zone. How much are you going to replace? Thinking about the community, the just element of the transition. As a power utility, how do you think about this topic? How do you think about moving away from coal and fossil into renewables? And what is your expectation from this whole traction ecosystem and transition credits?
Thanks, Vishal. As a context, ACEN, which is the energy platform of the Ayala Group, headquartered in the Philippines, was able to do the world's first market-based energy transition mechanism inspired by the ADB push from a couple of years ago. We moved swiftly, and that entailed the not only the divestment, but more importantly, the commitment to retire and transition the coal plant. It's a 246 megawatt coal plant in the Philippines after 25 years of operations. We all know that coal plants typically last until 40 to 50 years, so there's additionality right then and there. So we attracted ETM financing, both debt and equity. We recycled that capital to scale up renewables and so forth. So there's a committed date already, which is 2040, or 25 years of operations. Now, point number one. Point number two is we do recognize, however, that we need to allow for an increased ambition or a greater aspiration, especially because the world cannot wait for all coal plants to shut down as late as 2040. 100% of coal plants should shut down by 2040. We heard that earlier, right? But 55% of that, according to IEA, should be shut down or should be reduced by 2030 relative to 2022 figure. Now, we could always make the excuse in the global south that, you know, we are victims of this and it's not our doing and so forth, and therefore we should just, sit back and do nothing. But we don't subscribe to that. We appreciate the support that's coming from the global north. We are fortunate that there are mechanisms already, such as the ETS in Europe or carbon tax in Singapore, which is the first in Southeast Asia. These are opportunities, and especially with Article 6.2 or Article 6 being passed just recently, I think these are massive opportunities to increase the ambition, and we are just a microcosm of this. Ambition to accelerate from a 2040 retirement or transition to 2030. But there is that gap. What is this gap? I think there are three gaps, not just one. I think the study highlighted the gap on the archaic, foregone cash flows. That's definitely one key gap. There's at least a couple of others that need to be baked into the equation. Number two is there is a gap in terms of that replacement clean energy that is reliable, i.e. dispatchable, and affordable. A little bit of nuance here. We cannot just shut down a coal plant by 2030. The country needs it. We are in a tight supply situation. We are going to forego 1.8 billion kilowatt hours of output if we shut down a 246 megawatt coal plant. We need to replace that with a hybridized, or what we call a renewable energy storage, integrated renewable energy storage system, which is a combination of wind farm and solar with battery storage, about 1,000 megawatts and 4 to 6 hours of battery. That's what we hypothesize we need to deploy to be operational by 2030 if we are to shut down a coal plant by 2030. And that means we need to start building by 2027. It takes 3 years to build such thing. And the prices today of energy storage, that investment on an IRES system, or IRESS, Integrated Renewables and Energy Storage System, That's about $1.5 billion. And the levelized cost of electricity is about 40 to 50% higher than coal. Of course, there's a caveat. One is base load coal, another one is mid-merit. But leaving aside that detail, there is an affordability gap. We need to address that through transition credits. The other gap, the third, is the just transition, as Vikram rightfully points out. We need to decommission the plant responsibly, make sure that it cannot be recommissioned at some future date, and we need to do it responsibly, right? Where do the steel go, et cetera? How do we dispose of that, and so forth? And of course, the just transition of the communities and the workers affected. All of those have a cost. All of those have to be reflected in the transition credits. We think there's an opportunity given where transition credits are priced today. In Europe, it's 80 to 100 euros per ton. In Singapore, it's going to be 50 to 80 Sing dollars by 2030. That's about 36 to 60 US dollars, not too far away from euro. We think there's a solution space. We think there's a win-win, and I think the momentum is there. I love the fact that there are these initiatives and momentum being built, many thanks to MAS, 3CI, and all. It's an ecosystem approach. It's a whole-of-system approach. We're excited to be a part of this.
Indeed. I want to come to the demand side, right? You talked about the pricing in EU ETS and Singapore, but that assumes it's largely Article 6 demand. And given that you have visibility on the demand side, supply side, marketplace, Mikkel, would like to understand, do you see sufficient demand coming for these kind of credits? And who will these buyers be? And what is the willingness to pay beyond the offset against the taxes in some of these jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's the right question to ask. There's many complexities in getting this right, and my fellow panelists have talked about some of them, but ultimately, this is a demand question. You mentioned the size of this for this to get it right. If it takes 4.5 million credits to bridge that $70 million gap, and you have 1,500 projects that you need to decommission, we're talking about a market that is currently too small. So we need to solve for two things. We need to find buyers who want to buy these types of credits, and we need to do that without crowding out other good types of credits. So why do I think it can be done? I think it can be done partly because I think the price point looks reasonable, and two, because I think you have an asset class here which has a high degree of integrity if we get it right, with all those caveats that I said. Let me explain that. I think the numbers that we're looking at right now, and they will be highly dependent on the project, is about 15 to 17 US dollars. In the market that we have so far, that does sound a bit steep it doesn't come with corresponding adjustment. In other words, works into a compliance scheme. But the market doesn't need to pick up very much for this to be price competitive to some of the other removal projects. Now, this is not technically a removal project, but it has many of the features of the permanence of the, as you said, we know what we are closing down. Therefore, it has many of those right characteristics. So I think you'll, for that reason, will find a buyer group. At $15 to $17, I believe that the variance for that could be sometimes you need $40, sometimes you need $50, because, as you were alluding to, the fleet is on average 14 years perhaps, but in some countries like Bangladesh is 5 years old. And the just transition is a lot harder in some countries. So while 15 to 17 might anchor the conversation, it can be a lot more than that. So to answer your question, who do we need to get in here? Of course, we can rely on corporate buyers to do this, and I think to a large amount, we should try to do that. And we saw what came out, I think it was yesterday from the ETA, that they had found a coalition of some willing buyers, some real brand names. We, CIX, have done a demand survey that also helps to elucidate what kind of buyers would they be there for $15 to $17. But there is no doubt in my mind that it would be massively helpful if more countries do what Singapore just did and announce that with corresponding adjustments, they will take use of it. This all sums up to say, I think we need both a market that grows, two, corporate buyers who see the values because these have integrity, and three, the governments. But I want to make one final point if I can. we need to solve for one additional problem, which is rarely thought about. These $70 million that you talked about of a gap is not money that is needed at the end of the life of these projects. They're needed up front to make the transition happen. But these credits are generally only generated at the point of decommissioning, which is 5-7 years from now, or 5 years at least from now. So we need to sell these credits forward for actually to create the finance. So for that to happen, we need further additional certainty in this type of credit environment, or we will have a forward curve that looks really, really poor, and we will end up not having the finance we need.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. So firstly, I wanted to acknowledge that it's great that you have done some buyer survey, and what I'm taking away is that $15 to $18 a ton, you do see reasonable demand for these kind of credits coming in.
I think there's indication of it. Look, a survey of this many people will only give you so much indication. What I'm telling you is there are corporates that are interested, and there are governments that are interested.
That's fantastic news.
Vishal, can I jump in here? I'm
Yeah.
sorry to speak out of turn now, but I think
for
the $15 to $17 have been mentioned 4 or 5 times already, and I need to clarify that. Otherwise, it sticks as a headline number. I don't know, to be quite frank, what the right number is. All I know is that $15 to $17 can justify that cash flow, the variable number 1, which is replacing the foregone cash flows. It does not address points number 2 and number 3, the replacement energy. I'm not going to shut down. I have the power to shut down because we have a call option on that coal plant by 2030 and replace it with dispatchable renewables. That's 40% more expensive for the consumers. There's no way. That needs to be priced in. I'm not going to shut down by just switching it off and have an integrity issue. We need to dismantle it. There's a cost to that as well. That needs to be priced in. So lest people stick to the 15 to 17, I just want to caution that that's not the right number. Hypothesis.
Yeah.
Okay?
And fair enough.
I think that's why we need to do the compliance market. And that's where, let's look at the other side of the equation. It is a cheaper, I'm not saying it's going to be $100, which is the price of carbon removal and so forth. It's going to be a number in between, but I just want to put it out.
And I also think that it will be dependent on plant, right? I mean, depending on the technology, the dispatch factor, the age. So understand there's a big range. And there has to be a base load and a starting point of compliance-driven demand, which is, jurisdictions like Singapore and EU that can give that boost and hopefully get the ball rolling, right? So that's what I'm taking away. I'll come to you, Vikram. In addition to whatever thoughts you were going to share, I had one question for you, building on what Mikkel was talking about, which is this mismatch of the timing of the cash flow, right? If you can explain how does this work and in reality, how will the financiers and the utility players look at these cash flows and be able to capitalize it upfront to bridge this financing need?
Great. Let me just preface that by brief comment or comments on the pricing issue. That's not what we're here to discuss. But I just have to validate what Eric said. I think the point is that we can analyze the ETA announcement yesterday is the buyers are there, they're interested, but the question is how many buyers will pay that kind of price, upwards of 20 or whatever it is. The economists have told us, and we've all agreed, that carbon pricing needs to be in the $50 to $80 a ton range. But why do we get so surprised that carbon credits will tend to that price, particularly from coal, which is responsible for most of the carbonization of the economy, right, which you got to decarbonize. So I think we just sort of keep those trend lines in mind. Business has to move, and that's why I think compliance markets are good to start with, because business has to move from beyond charity to on balance sheet before they're going to put out that kind of money, right? So there are other related issues that have to be resolved in the market. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do the pilots, and that doesn't mean that they may not, and we'll have to find other ways of funding them, and I'll come to that in a minute. The final point I want to make, and this comes out of a World Bank study, we look at corresponding adjustments and sovereign things. I think in the early days we'll be able to manage, but as more and more of these get done, the marginal cost of the corresponding adjustment is going to go up. For the simple reason that you're now pushing into the abatement curve of the country And they're not going to give you the cheap credits up front only to be left holding the bag for expensive credits later. So I think this dynamic is going to push the pricing up. Having said that, I think the point is, and I think you used the example, that if you're going to exit by 2040, you have to start building at least in 2037, right? Or sorry, 2027 for a...
That's a 2030 exit.
For a 2030 exit. Whenever you start building, and it's at the plant level, if it's at multiple asset level, you need money today. If you're going to borrow today in order to generate these credits tomorrow, there is a cost associated with that too. And one potential way that has been done, and I don't think like in the old world, I don't think it's the buyer's role to be providing advance payments. I think it is the financial markets that need to come in. They need to look at securitizing these future cash flows whenever they happen. If Eric needs his money at whatever price in order to build his renewables in 2026 so that he can break ground in 2027, it needs to be there. And sometimes it's going to be 3 years, sometimes it's going to be longer. But these financial institutions have their own issues around portfolio emissions. So first, they have to get comfortable with the whole coal issue, which I think they are, of exiting coal. 2, they have to be absolutely comfortable with the integrity, because we know the blowbacks that have happened.
Yeah.
And even though we are safer than nature-based solutions, safer in quotes, I think the integrity that methodologies will bring to the table are going to be critical. And this is on the environmental and other carbon market integrity. Of course, the environmental, social governance stuff, whether it's equator principles and all, will all have to, or IFC standards will have to apply. Finally, I think there has to be a role for the financial sector to play integrated with the financiers on delivery risk, the performance risk, right? So Eric, upstanding industrialist, power sort of CEO that he is, he's bankable, but is every coal plant bankable, especially if they're government-owned? So who's going to provide the underlying guarantee once the money goes out of the door, right? So there are all these issues that need to be resolved. But short answer, you're going to have to securitize future flows, and they're going to have to be based on a high-integrity carbon flow at a reasonable price.
Yeah, let me come to you, Pramod. This whole thing around securitization, we've also heard exactly as I said, there are other instruments that need to be thought about, just the risks that we're talking about, right? Especially if it is not on a balance sheet of a private entity, if it's a government, there's a political risk, there's a, what if there's a change of government and they decide to not shut down in 2030? There's a financial risk. A lot of these instruments are new-ish, right? So how do you securitize those? How does the financial sector think about it or should be thinking about it to give it a tailwind?
Thank you. Thanks for that. Let me speak about some of the work that we've done in securitization of infrastructure debt. And it's instructive because it's a different asset class, but it's instructive on how institutional investors would look at this. They would, A, be looking at the sponsor profile. Who exactly are they dealing with? You know, I'm proud to be sharing the stage with ACN. There are many sponsors around who are adopting a watch and wait approach. So the quality of the sponsor is going to be important. Their ability to move forward where the future is staring them in their faces around the possibility of stranded assets as ecosystems close in. So the demand-supply metrics around how sponsors might be behaving is quite important. Institutional investors would look at this. They would also look at, have there been any credible pilots done in this space that shows how exactly one of these complicated instruments might work? And I'm really pleased to say that based on our knowledge and announced knowledge around pilots around the region, especially with the work ADB has been doing around Southeast Asia, there is that assurance that institutional investors will look at how this could reasonably work. So I think those two are really very, very important. I think the commercial banks need to be a very strong supporting play when it comes to securitization, because they are the kind of pillars to getting the financing to work. And given that this is not coal, it's coal with a higher purpose, in that you're embracing to strangle, as someone used that phrase earlier this morning. You're trying to get rid of something that needs to go, but you need to do it with a clear alignment. So banks need to get comfortable. So the work that GFANZ has done, and which was announced yesterday, the work that GFIT has done around the Asia-Singapore taxonomy that was also announced yesterday, are going to be hugely valuable in bringing the other pieces of the ecosystem together. And finally, coming back to the first point around concessional capital being substituted by something else, and how that something else might be transition credits, one needs to see how that might work. And doing a few transactions around the region that give institutional investors comfort around how a securitization might potentially work, around diversification, around profile of sponsors, around the supporting ecosystem, I think would be the way forward. It's new. It probably needs a lot of work around getting it to be appropriately monetized, but there has been work done around infrastructure debt, Asia Pacific, over the last 5 years. And I'm sure many of those learning experiences could be equally applied to transition credits.
And when we're talking about transition credit, are we looking at purely market-based, or is there a role for hybrid where there is some concessionary capital to give it a boost, or not? I mean, how are you, and maybe, would be great to hear from you, Vikram, as well. How will this evolve?
I would like to think about them evolving in tandem, and at some stage, perhaps concessional credits backstopping transition credits. There are some vexing problems with transition credits. We don't know what's going to happen in 10 years' time. The plant may or may not shut down. The quality may or may not work. The price may or may not work. How about concessional credits backstop them in the sense that should they not eventuate, there is something to fall back on. Now, that could be a way to start. In time, as it develops the credibility, which I think it should develop with time and experience, that could possibly fall away. But I would expect, and I would sort of suggest, that they probably need to go hand in hand for the first few years.
Especially because, as I was alluding to in the beginning, and I don't want to get into the price point too much again, but because the range is so wide, I think it's not realistic to close down all of those things that we want to close down at the high range of this without any concessional finance. I just don't think we'll get to that price point, because then there'll be other credits that will outcompete them, because they will be priced competitively against some of the other ones.
Yeah. Any comments from you, Vikram?
Yeah,
But then
so-
I have a different question for Eric.
So some of the analysis we've done for the 3CI sort of impact, but also for some other accelerated coal retirement projects, including the ETA. I think this is, we shouldn't be presuming that the revenue from carbon credits is going to be enough to essentially facilitate the entire just transition countrywide. It'll vary plant by plant what share is available. I mean, we'll hear directly from him. But I would strike a note of caution. I totally understand that the private sector and the financial sector needs some sort of backstop risk. That's why I was referring to performance risk. I think we need to get, for that, either MEGA or some other multilateral agency, regional development bank involved, using already scarce concessional capital to then backstop what would be carbon revenues in the future. For a pilot, again, no issue if people want to try that. I'd just be concerned that not become sort of the de facto approach, but we'd rather push to have other sort of quasi-insurance or guarantee type products, which in turn may need concessional capital. I'm not saying that, but at least there's an evolution there that hopefully works. So,
yeah. Sorry, a different question for you, Eric. So we heard about the launch of the traction ecosystem, right? From a power utility point of view, what are the different things that you're looking for to make these transactions happen? Because you're looking at unlocking this at scale. And of course, the economic gap and you know, the three gaps actually that you talked about is something that will help, and that's what transition credits are hopefully going to allow for. What are the other kind of missing pieces in this puzzle that will really bring more utility companies such as yourself onto the table and say, yeah, these are the plans that we would like to offer for transition? What would make that happen?
I think, first of all, the market should be there. And I think it is critical to unlock the potential of a compliance market. I don't think just focusing on voluntary market, which is, you know, in a shaky position, for lack of a better term, these days, there's, you know, I think there's a huge opportunity for a compliance market. So I think, again, executing against Article 6.2 is critical. And it would be great for the global north, especially the ETS of Europe, to allow the purchase of these high integrity credits in the global south. I've been in discussions on the U.S. very hot topic because there's a debate whether the U.S. will go into the ETS system or carbon tax. Very political. I don't want to go there, but again, these are huge opportunities. Now, I want to also emphasize, because we can always talk about early coal retirement, financial structures, and so forth, but I don't want to sound as an alarmist here, but more as a realist. I heard the question earlier in the previous panel, which I think was spot on, which is, how can we retire all this? What's the replacement, and how do we address the growth, especially in the emerging Asia and so forth? Vietnam growing at 8-9%, Indonesia, Philippines, mid-high single digit. And by the way, we have transmission issues, right? So the answer is not build more solar and wind, because that's part of the answer. But if you stick there, you will create more problems for the grid, which is already limited. You need to build solar, wind, and storage, energy storage, ideally behind the meter, co-located with a plant, integrated renewable energy storage system, IRES. Yes, we can put storage, pump hydro, and so forth all across the grid to balance and so forth, but there's no replacement for integrated into the generation. Now, I'm saying that because in the Philippines, I think we're fortunate enough to be blessed with reasonable amounts of resources, whether it's sun or the wind. Australia, is a different orders of magnitude altogether in terms of quality. Vietnam has potential as well, solar, wind, hydro. Indonesia and Malaysia, I'm not sure, right? Solar, is not as compelling in Indonesia and Malaysia. There are locations. Wind is site-specific, right? But as close as you get to the equator, it can get very challenging. What I'm trying to say, and I absolutely agree with what Vikram's saying, in the early days, the replacement cost is relatively more affordable. I'm not saying very affordable because there's a gap, right? But replacing our coal plant with solar, wind, battery storage, that gap number 2 is not going to be enormous. But maybe you can do that for the first 3, 4, 5 gigawatts in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia. But beyond that, you have to replace that with imports of green molecules and so forth. It gets expensive. Or CCS, it gets more expensive. And I think that's what you meant. So we gotta move quickly because we don't have much time. Let's leverage those opportunities because the grid is a big problem, and we need to solve that as well.
Go for it, Michael.
I mean, something to add to that is, I think you're right. If we look at the MSCI study that came out last week, it suggests that in some of these grids, the amount of renewable energy, if we were to replace all of them, is above 150%. And here we're talking about the countries that really matters: India, China, Indonesia, to a certain extent Vietnam. But I'm getting the sense here that we have to solve all of it or nothing, which is obviously not the case here, right? I mean, we're talking about the BAU. If we get all of it solved, it's 73% reduction from BAU emissions right now. If we get 20%, isn't that okay as well? So what I'm trying to say is there are some that will be viable projects, and there are some that probably won't be for the reasons that you are saying. But I still think that there is a role to play if we can lift 20% reduction in emissions from BAU levels today. That's pretty high win for this region.
Yeah. I think we need
absolutely
to start
agree.
somewhere.
Absolutely agree. There's no
yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
We need to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And to get started, what I'm also hearing increasingly is the compliance market needs to play a very important role. I would like to ask, Mikkel, maybe you can give some perspectives, and then Vikram, if you have. Is there a risk that all these negotiations, bilateral on Article 6 between countries, can slow this down? And if yes, what would be the ask from governments and different stakeholders so that the Article 6 discussions kind of accelerate, that can give this whole transition credit a bit of a tailwind?
Yeah, perhaps, but it's not a question that is unique to this type of credits. If we want the carbon market to grow, we want Article 6 to work, we want CAs for these types of things, and it's complex. I'm relatively optimistic about the pace that we've seen. Again, I live in Singapore, I see all the MOUs that are being signed, I see what Japan has done, I see what Switzerland has done. Absolutely, we want everything to happen yesterday. But if you see where we were to compare to COP27, I think we come pretty far, and we now have a blueprint from what a good correspondingly adjusted credit framework needs to look like. So I think that there is a reasonable chance that these countries where it really matters will start to have the infrastructure to support correspondingly adjusted credit. If the will is there, it's different. And I think you do make a good point that there's a point in time where they move up the MAC curve and where this starts to get really, really hard. And that looks different for every country, but I'm not as pessimistic as you are. I think I'm very nervous about the complexity of these credits, and I think we underestimate that, but not on the CA part.
Yeah, final comment from you, and I'll open up for Q&A.
No, great. Look, on Article 6, it's the perfect place to start. The voluntary market is in not necessarily dire straits, but it's having difficulties. And part of it is growth pains, right? It was a CSR. It was a market targeted to CSR. Now we are asking it to grow up overnight and become the main conduit for transitioning to net zero. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. The other thing is there has to be some sort of compliance features that have to trickle into the voluntary markets in order for it to really get teeth, right? Now, whether it's through regulators or whether it's through domestic cap and trade kind of things that certain countries, perhaps like South Africa or others, can implement. And the third thing I think is there has to be an interconnectivity between Article 6 and these quasi-compliance markets. If you look at Europe's CBAM, right now there is no desire for them to be able to accept. Let's say South Africa tomorrow did a cap and trade, and the decarbonized coal credits using the 3CI methodology were available in the local market for Sasol and Anglo-American to buy. At this point, they should be allowed to show their deliver their product as CBAM compatible in Europe. And those are the kind of things also we need to simultaneously unlock, right? So,
Absolutely, yeah. 2 questions from the audience, and then we close, if there are any.
and while we are waiting, I want to plug the event, 3CI event at 3:30 across the hall in the Energy Transition Hub. If you aren't done yet, come for more.
Okay, good. So no more questions. Final closing comments from each one of you.
Let me go. I'm really super excited about what Traction is being set up to do. You know, I think it's being set up to solve 3 issues, which I think are somewhat bugbears in this whole space. You know, the first one is clearly standards. There are standards that need to be set around quantification, baselining, and the transition to RES, to renewable replacements. And I think these standards are being worked on, but I think a coordinating committee such as Traction will be able to help with this. The second big one is public perception, and whatever they do around creating some of the thoughts around taking away permanence issues, leakage, and double counting is really important. And finally, this timing issue around how do you solve for funding today versus a shutdown in 10 years' time, getting the right mechanisms, and hopefully coming up with either advanced market commitments or a futures market are all things that I think this committee will work on. So that would be my take of what the future might hold in terms of optimism.
Final ones from you, 10 seconds each.
I've been possibly the most positive here, so I'll end on a cautious note. I think we're only starting to dawn on us just how complex this is, for all the reasons we talked about as well. Let's make absolutely sure we get this one right. Let's get the first pilot to be super duper so that we don't end up with some of the criticisms we had in the past. But as I said, it's worth doing because it has the scale that we need in Southeast Asia. That was 10?
Yeah, well, 12.
So yes, we definitely agree with that. We need to get started with the pilots. It has to be, we then need to look at methodologies for other things, utility, you know, grid connected is one, first government-owned IPPs, ultimately moving to captives. And finally, I'd just say that the integrity bar needs to remain extremely high. And we need to make sure that these pilots sort of adhere to that. Perhaps standards will come in, but until then. we have to manage it. Thank you.
Last comments from you, Eric, and if you can share anything about the big reveal that is happening immediately after this.
I think Wanji will be asking for that in a bit, but couldn't agree more. I think we need to put this into action through a pilot. We're happy to be the pilot, part of the pilot, and we will be making some interesting announcements in a bit. But I think we're going to have to move with both principle and pragmatism, with speed, and we really need to scale this up. So really excited to be working with everyone, especially the traction and the various partners. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a picture?